The new chief of surgery had not seen her father in 4 years. Her brother swore he had moved to Arizona and wanted space. But on her third night shift, Jennifer found him sleeping in level B of the staff parking garage of the same hospital where he had worked 22 years as a boiler technician. He had survived 2 winters against the heat exhaust. And the reason he never fought back was worse than abandonment. Jennifer had come home to run the surgical floor, not to reopen old wounds. 4 years ago, her father Robert stopped calling. Her brother Gary said he had moved to Arizona, that he wanted space, that she should stop asking. She believed him. Now she stood in level B of the staff garage, watching the man who had fixed the hospital's boilers for 22 years fold a thin blanket beside the heat exhaust. He was not lost. He was hiding. And the truth about why would force Jennifer to choose between protecting her brother and saving her father. But Jennifer did not make that choice in the garage. She made it 3 hours later in a small exam room when her father finally said her name. For 6 days, she had walked these corridors as the new chief of surgery, shaking hands, reviewing case logs, ignoring the fact that the building still carried her father's fingerprints. Robert had worked in the hospital's boiler room for 22 years. He had raised Jennifer on stories of steam pressure and backup generators. As a girl, she waited outside the maintenance office while he finished night shifts. He called the heating system the hospital's heartbeat. She became a surgeon because she wanted to fix hearts. He fixed the machine that kept the building alive. But after her mother died, the calls grew shorter. Then Gary began answering Robert's phone. He said their father was tired, confused, needed rest. Then he said Robert had moved to Arizona and wanted space. Then he said Jennifer should focus on her residency and stop asking. Now Robert sat on the exam table, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket. His hands rested on his knees like 2 worn-out tools. He was thinner than she remembered. Ice burns marked the skin near his wrists. But his eyes were clear. He was not confused. He was not lost. He was hiding. Jennifer asked why. He did not look at her. He looked at the floor. Gary said it would be easier if I disappeared. The words did not land at once. Jennifer had spent 4 years believing her father had chosen distance. Now he was sitting 6 feet away, telling her he had been erased by her own brother. Robert admitted he had spent the first 2 years in shelters, bus stations, and under an overpass. Then, 2 winters ago, he had found level B. He knew the heat exhaust schedule better than anyone. He had timed his sleep to the building's old rhythm. She asked why he never called. He said he did not want her to see him like this. He said Gary had paid for a room until the money stopped. Then the pension was gone. Then the house was gone. Then he said something that made no sense. He said Gary had done nothing wrong. He said the court had approved everything. Jennifer is a surgeon. She knows when a patient is lying to protect someone else. She admitted him under the hospital's charity program, not as Robert Ward, but as an unidentified former employee. She did not call Gary. She did not call the police. She ordered a full workup and then did what she always does when the surface story does not match the body in front of her. She pulled the records. What she found stopped her cold. A guardianship order, 3 years old, declared Robert incapable of managing his own affairs. Gary was listed as guardian. The petition included a medical report describing early dementia and poor judgment. It was signed by a doctor Jennifer had never met. But Robert had requested the hearing according to the file. He had agreed to give Gary control of everything. That was the first wrong note. A man with early dementia does not negotiate his own surrender. Then she found his old employee file. 22 years of clean service. No complaints, no write-ups. Except one document near the back, sealed under an old legal notice. 15 years ago, Robert had been arrested for assaulting a supervisor in the boiler room. He pleaded guilty. He served 6 months. Then he returned to work as if nothing had happened. Jennifer remembered that year. She was 19. Her father missed Christmas for the first time ever. Gary told her Robert had taken a second job, but Gary had come home that winter with a car he could not afford. Gary had been 18. She closed the file. Her hands were shaking. She had spent 15 years believing her father had a temper he never showed her. Now, the belief cracked. She returned to the exam room. Robert was asleep, but his hands moved. She pulled back the blanket and looked at them closely. His fingers were stiff, curved inward. A constant tremor ran across the backs of his hands. The skin was gray and thick at the knuckles. She had assumed it was cold damage from sleeping in the garage. But this was different. This was nerve damage. She ordered a heavy metal panel and a neurology consult. Then she sat beside him and waited. She did not yet know that the hospital had never inspected the boiler room he worked in. She did not know that the same hands that had kept the heat alive had been absorbing a slow poison for decades. And she did not know that Gary had been at the hospital earlier that week, asking if any old employees had been admitted recently. But at 7 the next morning, the lab called. Jennifer answered. The results were not borderline. They were not the moderate exposure she had prepared for. They were catastrophic. And the truth about her father's hands was bigger than a family fight. It was a hospital secret 22 years in the making. The lab results were not just alarming. They were a record of exposure to an industrial solvent called N-hexane. For 22 years, Robert Ward had cleaned boiler parts with a chemical that destroys nerve endings. The hospital knew it was dangerous. The evidence had been sitting in a locked file for over a decade. Jennifer did not sleep that night. She sat in her office with her father's chart open and a medical dictionary on the screen. The test showed catastrophic axonal damage. His hands had not failed suddenly. They had been dying for years while he still showed up to work. She thought of all the times she had seen him rub his fingers after a shift. He said it was arthritis. It was not. She began pulling old maintenance logs. Most were missing. The ones that remained showed the hospital had purchased industrial-grade solvent from 1986 until 2004. The same chemical. No gloves, no respirators. The boiler room had one small vent near the ceiling. Robert had worked in that air for 2 decades. Then she found the memo. It was dated March 11th, 1999. A safety officer named Douglas Hall had written to the hospital administrator. He warned that the boiler room ventilation was inadequate and that workers were absorbing solvent through their skin during routine cleaning. He recommended immediate protective equipment and a formal air quality review. The memo had one word stamped at the bottom: no action taken. Jennifer read it 3 times. The hospital had not simply ignored a problem, they had been told. And they had kept the boiler room open exactly as it was. Robert woke the next morning in a small room off the surgical floor. He did not know where he was. When Jennifer entered, he tried to sit up. His hands could not close around the cup of water on the tray. She steadied it for him. He looked ashamed. She asked him about the solvent. He did not answer at first. Then he said the job was all he had. He said a man does not complain when the work is dangerous. He said he thought the tingling was just part of getting older. He called it the price of loyalty. Jennifer asked if the hospital had ever offered medical checks. He said no. The only time anyone paid attention was when a doctor noticed his hands shaking during a physical. The hospital sent him to a specialist. The specialist told him he had early peripheral neuropathy. That was 8 years ago. 8 years ago. Jennifer repeated the date. That was 1 year after Gary had started handling Robert's paperwork. She opened the guardianship file again. The medical report used to declare Robert incompetent was signed by a doctor named Alan Reeve. It described confusion, memory loss, and an inability to handle money. It did not mention neuropathy. It did not mention solvent exposure. It said Robert was no longer able to work. But Robert had never stopped working. He had been forced out after the guardianship was approved. Gary had told him the hospital said he was a danger. Robert had believed it. Jennifer searched the hospital's legal archive. It took 2 hours. She found a private settlement agreement from 8 years prior. Robert Ward had filed a workers' compensation claim for occupational neuropathy. The hospital had settled for $120,000. The agreement required the hospital to fund annual neurological monitoring for the rest of his life. It also contained a confidentiality clause. Robert's signature was on the last page, but Robert did not remember signing a settlement. He remembered a lawyer named Keller who worked for Gary. The lawyer said the hospital would pay for his medical care. Robert trusted Gary to handle the details. The money went into an account Gary controlled. The monitoring never happened. Jennifer pulled the bank records attached to the trust. The settlement deposit was there. Withdrawals followed. A car, a down payment, travel, some of it went to a restaurant Gary owned. Within 3 years, the account was empty. Then Gary filed for guardianship. He used the same doctor, Alan Reeve, to claim Robert was losing his mind. By then, Robert had no money to fight. She did not call Gary. She called the state medical board. Alan Reeve's license had been suspended 15 months earlier for fraudulent capacity evaluations. He had signed hundreds of guardianship reports without ever meeting patients. Gary had found him through a lawyer who specialized in exactly that kind of case. Jennifer sat in the hospital cafeteria, looking at the settlement agreement. She understood the shape of the lie now. Gary had stolen Robert's injury money, then used a fake doctor to erase Robert's legal identity, then left him to sleep on concrete. But the hospital was not innocent. They had paid Robert off instead of fixing the boiler room. They had kept the solvent in use for years after the safety memo. They had protected themselves with a confidentiality clause that buried the danger. The next morning, Jennifer called a lawyer. Not a family lawyer, an occupational injury specialist. She did not tell Robert. She did not tell Gary. She filed a claim against the hospital for failing to protect a worker from a known neurotoxin and for concealing the injury. She asked for his employment files, safety inspections, and air quality reports. The hospital had 90 days to respond. But Gary found out. He arrived at the hospital on a Thursday afternoon. Jennifer was at the nurse's station when she saw him at the end of the hall. He had the same lean face, the same easy smile, but his eyes were moving too fast. He asked to speak in private. In the empty family conference room, Gary closed the door and placed a document on the table. It was the guardianship order. He said Robert was under his care. He said Jennifer had no right to admit him without consent. He demanded she transfer Robert to a facility of his choosing. Jennifer did not touch the paper. She said she had filed a report with the state agency that investigates elder exploitation. She said she had found the settlement. She said she knew about Alan Reeve. Gary's smile left. He said she was making a mistake. He said Robert was sick, and if she pushed this, everything would come out. He said she did not know what Robert had done. Jennifer leaned forward. She said she knew about the assault conviction. She knew Gary had been the one who put the supervisor in the hospital. She knew Robert had taken the charge to keep Gary out of prison. Gary went still. Then he said the part Jennifer had not prepared for. He said yes, Robert took the charge for him. But Robert also made him sign a confession. Gary had been 18. Robert kept the signed paper in a safe deposit box. For years, Gary had done everything Robert asked because of that paper. Then, the paper disappeared. Gary claimed Robert lost it. Robert denied it. The fight that followed was terrible. Gary looked at Jennifer with something between anger and fear. He said he had not stolen Robert's life. He had taken it back. The guardianship was not revenge. It was protection. Because Robert had told Gary that if the confession ever surfaced, Gary would finally face what he did. Gary had spent 20 years hiding from it. He stepped closer. If you expose the hospital, the entire guardianship file becomes public. The old conviction will come up. And then everyone will see that Robert lied under oath. He will lose everything. Jennifer shook her head. He already lost everything. Gary laughed once. No, he still has his freedom. If the court reopens the assault, he could be charged with perjury and obstruction. The conviction could be vacated. But that means you have to prove Gary did it. And Gary is the one person you have been trying to save. He was right. She had spent her whole life trying to save him. Gary picked up the guardianship order. He said he would be back with the police if Robert was not discharged within 24 hours. Then he walked out. Jennifer stood alone. The hospital's lawyers had already started calling. The claim was moving faster than she expected. But the deeper she went, the more she realized the hospital had covered up more than unsafe conditions. Somewhere in the old records were proof of what Gary was truly afraid of. And Gary was not the only one in the family keeping a secret. That was the first time Jennifer wondered if she had misread the last 4 years entirely. She had thought Gary erased Robert. But maybe Robert had chosen to disappear. Maybe he was not hiding from Gary. Maybe he was hiding from the moment the truth would finally come for the wrong person. The hospital offered $20,000 to make the case go away. Jennifer did not even open the envelope. She had learned enough by then. The safety memo from 1999 was the first thread. When she pulled it, the whole wall began to loosen. Douglas Hall, the safety officer who wrote the warning, was still alive. He had been fired 6 months after filing the memo. The official reason was downsizing. The real reason was that he refused to stop asking about air quality in the boiler room. He had kept copies of every report, every email, every unanswered request. He gave them to Jennifer without being asked. Those documents showed a pattern. The hospital had not just ignored one warning, it had ignored 11. 3 separate inspections had recommended replacing the solvent or installing mechanical ventilation. Each time, the administrator approved the cost and then quietly diverted the money. Twice, maintenance workers were told the repairs had been made when they had not been. Robert had signed off on none of it. He had only done what he was told. But Robert was not the only one. Hospital employment records from that period listed 34 men who had worked in the boiler room for more than 5 years. Jennifer asked a paralegal to trace their current medical histories. What came back was not subtle. 14 had been diagnosed with peripheral neuropathy. 11 had died. Their families did not know why. The case stopped being about one father and one daughter. It became a full occupational exposure lawsuit representing every worker who had ever cleaned those pipes. The hospital responded by hiring one of the largest defense firms in the state. They argued that the statute of limitations had expired. They argued that Robert had agreed to the confidentiality clause. They argued that the solvent was used safely and that the nerve damage could have come from alcohol or diabetes. Jennifer knew better. She had his blood work. She had the air samples Douglas Hall had hidden in his garage for 20 years. The solvent was there. The hospital knew. Then, Gary made his move. He filed an emergency motion to remove Robert from Jennifer's care. He claimed Jennifer was exploiting a vulnerable man to build a lawsuit. He submitted a new psychiatric report from another doctor. The doctor had never met Robert either. This one said Robert was incapable of understanding legal proceedings and needed around-the-clock supervision at a facility chosen by Gary. The facility was 200 miles away. Jennifer did not challenge the motion with family law. She challenged it with the guardianship court. She submitted the evidence of the fraudulent evaluation. She submitted bank records showing the settlement money had been drained before the guardianship was filed. She submitted Gary's restaurant ownership papers and the dates of his car purchases. Then she submitted the one thing Gary had never thought she would find: the original case file for the assault conviction. It was buried in a closed record archive. A retired clerk had kept a personal index of sealed files. The files showed that the supervisor Robert had supposedly attacked had been named in 3 other complaints by junior staff. It showed the supervisor had been drunk on shift the night of the incident. It showed Gary's fingerprints on the wrench that broke the supervisor's jaw. And it showed Robert's plea agreement did not match the timeline. He had been at the hospital's off-site warehouse when the assault occurred. He could not have done it. Jennifer did not use the file to free her father. She used it to show the guardianship court that the family secret Gary held over Robert was built on a lie. Because Gary had not been the one with the secret. Robert had been. He had known the confession Gary signed was worthless. He had known the evidence would have cleared him. He had kept that paper in a safe deposit box for 15 years, not as a threat, but as a shield. When Gary came looking for it, Robert could have produced it and ended the manipulation. He could have proven his innocence and sent Gary to prison. He chose not to, because the only thing he could not bear was for his son to know what he had almost done to him. The court removed Gary as guardian. It did not send him to prison because Robert refused to press charges, but it opened the old conviction for review. The judge called the original plea a manifest injustice and vacated it. Robert Ward was legally innocent for the first time in 15 years. He cried in the courtroom. Jennifer held his hands. They were still shaking. The hospital settled the occupational case 4 months later. The number was not made public, but it was enough to build 140 beds. Jennifer did not take a fee. She directed the entire amount into a nonprofit. The hospital also agreed to fund independent health monitoring for every surviving boiler room worker and their families. They were required to post the safety records in the main lobby for 10 years, but the money did not change what had happened to Robert's body. The nerve damage was permanent. He would never regain full use of his hands. The cold in the parking garage had accelerated what the solvent had started. His feet had begun to fail. He would never live alone again. Jennifer asked him where he wanted to go. He said he did not want to be a burden. She told him he had spent 22 years keeping a hospital alive. That is not the definition of a burden. She moved him into a small apartment near the hospital. For the first month, he slept with the lights on. He would not ride in elevators. He kept a blanket folded beside his bed, as if he might need to leave in the night. Jennifer did not push. She only left the door unlocked. She knew that some forms of safety are learned slowly. Gary disappeared for 2 months. Then he sent Jennifer a letter. It was 3 pages. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked if Robert would agree to see him. Jennifer gave the letter to Robert without reading it fully. Robert held the pages between his stiff fingers and stared at them for a long time. Then he nodded. He said Gary had always been the one who needed a witness. Jennifer did not understand. Robert said that some people do not believe they are real until someone watches them hurt someone. He had watched Gary hurt him for years because he thought if he stopped being the witness, Gary would stop being a person. The transitional housing wing opened on a gray morning in late spring. The hospital named it for Robert Ward, but he refused to cut the ribbon. He said his hands were not made for scissors, so Jennifer cut it with him, her hand over his. The blade sliding through the red cloth together. Gary was invited. He sat in the front row. Robert spoke from a wheelchair. His voice was soft but steady. He said the building was not for him. It was for people who had lived too long in places that were not built for sleeping. He said the heating system would run all night, every night. Then he looked at Gary in the front row and said the only thing that ever kept him from coming home was the fear that his son had finally become the man he used to pretend to protect. Gary did not look away. After the ceremony, Jennifer found Gary standing near the parking garage entrance. He was looking down the ramp. She asked if he remembered the last time he had been there. He said he had driven through twice while Robert was sleeping below. He had seen the blanket and had not stopped. He had told himself it was not his problem. Then he asked Jennifer if Robert would ever forgive him. She said Robert already had. That was the worst part, because Robert had forgiven Gary years ago, before the garage, before the forged guardianship, before the cold. He had forgiven him the night he signed the false confession. Gary had never had to ask. He had only needed to stop running. Gary put his face in his hands. Jennifer did not comfort him. She walked back toward the new building where her father was laughing with a group of former boiler room workers. One of them was wearing a pair of thick black gloves. He raised them in the air and said they were the first new safety gloves he had ever been given. Robert laughed so hard he started coughing. The men around him laughed too. Some of them had not laughed in years. That evening, Jennifer sat alone in her office. The hospital had changed its name on several of the old maintenance doors. But if you looked closely, you could still see the faded outline of the word boiler room beneath the new paint. She put her hand flat against the wall. It was warm. She finally understood what her father had meant all those years when he called the heating system the hospital's heartbeat. It was not the pipes, it was the people who kept them alive. People who worked through the night and were never seen. People who signed away their pain so someone else could be warm. People like Robert. The hospital had offered to name a surgical wing after Jennifer. She refused. She asked them to name the night shift maintenance office after Douglas Hall. They did. And on the plaque, beneath his name, they added the words he had written in 1999. No action taken is still an action. Jennifer reads that line every time she walks into the building. She does not know if it is a warning or a promise. Maybe it is both. But on the nights when the heat kicks on and the old pipes hum, she likes to stand beside the door and listen. She likes to think her father can still hear it too. Only now, he is warm. The story of Robert Ward is not really about a parking garage. It is about the people we walk past. The ones who keep the lights on, the rooms warm, the machines running. They are not invisible because they are unimportant. They are invisible because the system counts on us not looking too closely. Jennifer could have stopped when she found her father. She could have brought him home and never opened a single file. But she understood that the same silence that allowed Robert to sleep beside a heat exhaust had been at work for decades inside the hospital walls. It was not one villain. It was a chain of small decisions. A delayed inspection, a diverted budget, a confidential settlement, a lawyer who knew a doctor who would sign anything, a son who stopped answering his father's calls. Most people will never become chief of surgery. Most people will never win a settlement large enough to build a housing wing. But most people will, at some point, stand in a room where someone is being erased and feel the pull to say nothing. That is the quiet part of this story. The moment before Jennifer acted. The moment before Belle saw an old woman falling. The moment before anyone speaks. Robert did not become a hero because he suffered. He became a symbol because one person refused to look away. Jennifer did not save her father by fighting harder than the hospital. She saved him by refusing to accept a lie that had been repeated until it sounded like truth. The hospital eventually changed its safety policies. The settlement built something permanent, but Robert's hands still shake. His feet still fail. No judgment can give him back 2 decades of healthy nerve endings. That is what makes this story difficult. Justice came, but it did not come whole. It never does. The damage remains inside a man who only wanted to do his job. And yet the boiler room still hums. The heat still rises. Somewhere in the new wing, a nurse's station lights up at 3 in the morning. A patient rings for help. The building answers. It was not the pipes that taught Jennifer to listen. It was her father. If this story stayed with you, let it change the way you look at the people keeping your world running. The man in the parking garage. The woman cleaning the stairs. The security guard who looks too tired to stand. They are not background. They are the load-bearing part of the story. If you believe those people deserve to be seen, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that no action taken is still an action. And when you walk into a warm building tonight, ask yourself who paid for that heat. Their answer deserves to be known.